Good morning and good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine. I'm Chief Executive of the Australia UK Chamber in London. And thank you very much for joining us for our webinar on resilience, leading through crisis and beyond. A very warm welcome indeed to those joining us from the UK, from Australia and beyond. This webinar is a companion piece to our recently released report on resilience, which brought together insights from leaders across our membership and network on some of the biggest crises they've faced, their responses and lessons learned. In a year in which crisis has become, unfortunately, the norm, it's an incredibly relevant report and a really absorbing read. If you haven't already done so, then I do, of course, encourage you to check out the report. You can find it on our website, and we'll also send out the link after this event. We're very fortunate to have three fantastic contributors from our report speaking today. We have Stuart Ellis, CEO of the Australasian Fire and Emergency Services Authorities Council, otherwise known as AFAC, Sam Lyon, Managing Director of renowned research and campaigns consultancy and advisory CT Partners, and Elizabeth Vega, OBE, Group CEO for Informed Solutions, a leader in digital transformation, working in complex environments, including emergency services. Thanks so much to all of our speakers for joining us, and a special thanks to Liz and her team at Informed Solutions, who have been our valued partners for the Resilience Report and webinar. Liz, it's been immensely rewarding to work with a partner who is as invested in this topic as you are, and focused on how we can apply the very tough lessons learned through crisis to create stronger, more resilient organizations and also communities. Thank you very much to Liz, to Blaze, and to the whole team at Informed for your commitment to this agenda, which I know runs through everything you do. Okay, let's dive in. A note on today's running order. We're starting with a conversation with Stuart on his insights on resilience drawn from a truly inspiring career on the front line of emergencies, including the Christchurch earthquake and multiple bushfire seasons. And we'll then have a chat with Sam and Liz on the practical and strategic elements of managing and also learning from crisis. We'll wrap with audience Q&A. So please do type your questions for Stuart, Sam and Liz into the Q&A box below at the bottom of your screen. And please, I do encourage you to share often and share early. I'm now pleased to introduce Stuart Ellis, who, as I say, is the CEO for AFAC, who is joining us in the evening from South Australia. Welcome, Stuart.
Good evening, Catherine. Thank you.
How are things in Port Elliot, where you're dialing in from?
Very pleasant. Thanks very much. So, yes, slightly overcast, but warm.
Yeah. Well, look, it's great to have you with us, and thank you so much for making the time to join us. And thank you very much for your contribution to our report. In the report, you wrote about the elements that go into responding to a crisis. As I mentioned, you've been involved in the response or the review of several really devastating crises, including the Christchurch earthquake and Australia's recent 2019 bushfire season. In the report, you share your experiences and insights on what you call the art of emergency management. Can you talk us through the key elements that you think go into the art of emergency management?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So in my view, emergency management is both a science and an art. The science is relatively straightforward. It's imperfect. We don't always get it right, but it's the forecasting, the planning, looking at all aspects of risk, whether it be for earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, and of course fires here in Australia. And so that aspect is the science, the mechanics of preparing for emergencies. The art of emergency management has a lot to do with decision making, and it's decision making under pressure. It's decision making in a fluid environment. Excuse the pun for floods. It's decision making with insufficient time, and not in the normal construct that executives would make those decisions, whether it be in business or certainly within government. And so it's that ability to make decisions in that environment, which certainly is an art, which needs to be practiced. And part of the reliance we have for that is operating in trusted networks. Trusted networks are vitally important, and they cannot be created at the time. They really are dependent on building relationships and trust well before an event, so that you can rely on people you understand, you have a common understanding, whether it be with service providers or with other agencies. That's another part of that art. And I'd say the other element is communication, because really in emergencies, we can't communicate enough. And there's lots of, there are lots of technology and other elements to assist us, which we'll hear more about. But that decision-making, operating in trusted networks with communication is the art, and the science is around the planning, the preparation, the prediction, and the mitigation.
Thank you, Stuart. I think those are three fascinating points and tenets of responding to crisis. And what really stood out for me in the report was your point around having to invest before a crisis in your networks, both internal and external. And I want to come back to that. But before we do, I want to pick up on your first point around making decisions and leading in very uncertain situations. There's presumably experience and judgment that comes into that you have people who have been in similar situations before whose experience lends themselves to making the right decisions. But I imagine that there are other processes and platforms that support making the right decisions at the right time. Can you talk us through how you see those elements coming together? Look,
I think decision-making, having a process is really worthwhile. I've been in the unfortunate situation of explaining actions in inquiries afterwards, and just saying, drawing on 20 or 30 years experience and my judgment doesn't really carry the day, in my view. You do need to be able to explain a process around looking at options, identifying all the contributing issues to that decision at the time, and then funneling that down to why you made that particular decision at that particular time. I mean, nearly in every case, in hindsight, there's 20/20 vision. You could have made a better decision, but you need to have a process of how you make those decisions and be able to recall that methodology. And it may not always be the right decision, but I am very much convinced that making a decision is, in emergency situations, we're better off making a decision than dithering, because dithering really doesn't help anyone in these situations. And so, we've certainly got to draw on our experience, but we've got to be very aware of the factors, rely on the advice of our people in the field, and work through a process of looking at options, and then make that decision.
Thanks, Stuart. You touched upon the reviews that can often happen after crises, and you chaired the 2004 National Bushfire Inquiry, and you were also involved in the Royal Commission following the incredibly tragic 2019-20 bushfires, which were closely followed in Australia and closely followed globally. And in that inquiry, you stressed the need for a national focus in responding to bushfires. Why do you think that is important? And I suppose extrapolating that out into other situations where groups have to come together to respond to crisis, what do you think are the principles for motivating and driving large-scale cooperation in the face of big crises?
As I'm sure everyone's aware, Australia's a federation, Catherine. It's 6 states and 2 territories, and certainly in the natural disasters that we have identified in recent times, and indeed with COVID that we're all experiencing currently, one state doesn't have the resources or the wherewithal really to effectively respond. And we've become reliant on being able to move resources between states and territories, whether it be aircraft, firefighters, SES personnel in these recent floods. And so we need to have a consistency of understanding, of terminology, of approaches, to enable us to do that, and to also be prepared to share those resources, as people would appreciate, particularly perhaps during fast-moving fires and with the threat of fires across Australia during the summer. Giving up resources from one state to lend a hand in another state is a big decision, because those people become tired, apart from not being available, or those aircraft not being available. They're unavailable for you in your state for some time afterwards, as they need rest and so on. So we need to have that cooperation. And from an Australian perspective, because it's not in the Constitution, that's a state and territory responsibility. And that's why AFAC exists, to enhance that coordination between the states and territories. So there's that mutual obligation and mutual willingness to support one another.
And at the moment, of course, we've had floods in Australia, which has brought its own set of tragedies and challenges. But there is obviously an opportunity at the moment between the 2019-20 bushfire season and whenever the next season will be, to do some of that pre-investment that you spoke about in relationships, in expertise, in networks, in partnerships. So how is that looking for you at the moment? What's the work that AFAC and its partners are doing in between danger seasons or risk seasons?
Look, looking at a lot of option analysis, certainly identifying risks. I mean, resilience is a system. Part of that system is identifying risks. Part of that system is identifying resources. Certainly planning has a huge part to play. So land use planning. Natural disasters only become disasters because we're in the way of those natural events. And so where we put our housing and our infrastructure becomes a really critical issue. And after these major events, how we can harden that infrastructure, or indeed move those communities or elements of those communities out of danger, significantly improves community resilience for the future.
You spoke just before, when we talked about state cooperation, about how fatigued people can become, particularly in really severe and protracted crises. And one of the things that came through really clearly in the report is the importance of taking care of your people in a crisis. In the UK, of course, as you know, we've been in a very protracted lockdown, a sort of very long crisis. And people are understandably really, really worn down, which can be very tough for leaders to manage. And I can only imagine how tough it must be during a long bushfire season to keep exhausted teams motivated and on mission. So how do you approach that in a bushfire season and balance the need for urgent response with motivating and caring for your team?
Look, I think we thought that 1920 fire season was what we refer to as a campaign season, because it went for 6 months. But of course, your experiences with COVID have much surpassed that, and that is a real challenge. There's a real power in physically visiting whenever we can. I know that's an enormous challenge. So I guess virtually visiting is the next best option. But being in contact with our people, making those little calls, I think just being able to speak, but also see people, we can often tell how people are coping by the sounds of their voice, and how they're looking. And leaders have a real responsibility to look after ourselves. I think, as we deteriorate during those long serving events, our ability to make good and balanced decisions deteriorates. I mean, that becomes very evident to our people. You know, our people know us potentially better than we do. They can certainly see us in a way that we can't. And so we need to make sure that we are coping sufficiently and we are managing ourselves adequately so we can serve them best. And that's vitally important.
And I suppose model those behaviors to your team. That's something that one of the leaders in our report commented on, that sometimes it's really important, even if you feel immense responsibility, to walk away, to take a break, to demonstrate to other team members, to those working with and for you, that you need to do that. You need to have the time to recharge and rejuvenate so that you can fight the next front.
No, absolutely. I mean, there is that, you know, there's that innate feeling that we need to be there, but the practicality is we can't be there all the time. And I think we've got to use our judgments to make sure we're there when we really do need to be, but also be prepared to step away and rely on our people, as we should during other times.
We spoke pre this webinar about how unifying and sustaining the sense of a mission can be for motivating people. And I suppose that's incredibly true in firefighting, which is largely volunteer-based. Is that something which you think factors into resilience, having a sense of a mission, having a sense of purpose in a crisis?
Look, it absolutely does. And I think during these natural disasters and during COVID, I mean, they're often overwhelming, as we've all experienced. And so maintaining that clear sense of vision, acknowledging the successes that we are able to achieve, I think having a sufficiently strategic view that we may not be able to stop the fire or the flood or indeed COVID, but how can we best protect our people? And so that often changes our view to just a people-focused view, which I think during these emergencies has to be our number one priority. And so, you know, if I use the fire as an example, we may not be able to fight or stop the fire, but we can move people to a safer area. And so we need to make that our focus, and that becomes vital, reinforcing that goal of what we're out to achieve. And in that last 1920 season, you know, we feel we did that pretty well. We feel we saved physical infrastructure well, but we really fell down from an environmental perspective. So, you know, I guess prioritizing those issues becomes critical, and that reinforcing that to staff is very important.
One last question before we wrap this part of the session. You touched earlier upon some of the personal pressures that you can face as a leader through crisis, and I want to tease that out a little bit more. You've worked in emergency response for over 20 years, and you've had to shoulder immense responsibility over that time through some really harrowing circumstances. So from a personal perspective, I'd just be interested in hearing about what are some of the skills and the strategies that you've developed over that time to withstand that pressure, lead through crisis, and frankly, stay sane.
Look, I think we need to show humility. You know, these are times when people are under enormous pressure, and we see that, you know, currently with our healthcare workers, that they're doing their very best. We're all human, and sometimes it's not perfect. Sometimes mistakes are made. You know, I think it's very concerning when we repeat mistakes, but I think having humility in those situations, which is sort of, it may be counterintuitive in a sense. We're often the front person that needs to step forward to the camera or step, you know, next to the politician during these crises. But we also need to show humility we need to keep our temper. I think losing a temper is a terribly destructive action during these events. It really serves very little purpose, and it can do a huge amount of damage to individuals. And I think the mission we're trying to achieve at the time. So it's hard to stay calm during all these things, but I don't think getting angry is particularly helpful, and I certainly try and maintain a check on that. But just as we were talking about before, looking after ourselves, trying to get a little bit of exercise somehow, if it's just a walk around the park at a free moment, that's very important, because we need to retain our own resilience.
Great words to end on, at least for the moment. Thank you so much, Stuart. I mean, that was incredibly thought-provoking and inspiring. I love what you said about resilience as a system. I think there can sometimes be a tendency, particularly with events like fires, to say, well, this is something that is completely out of our control, which to a degree is true. However, our response is in our control, and having those systems of resilience in place, I think, are really vital to making sure that we remain feeling empowered and that we empower those around us. So thank you so much for sharing your insights, and thank you so much for the work you have done in your career, but particularly over the 1920 bush season. As I said, so many people on this call will have followed that bushfire season incredibly closely and with huge horror and deep sorrow. And we thank you so much for the work that you did over that time. We look forward to having you back for Q&A soon. And we'll say goodbye for now. Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you. I'm now pleased to introduce our next two speakers, Liz Vega, Group CEO for Informed Solutions, and Sam Lyons, Managing Director for CT Group. Hi, Liz, joining us from Manchester.
Indeed. Hello, Catherine.
Hello,
Hello,
and hi,
Catherine.
Sam, joining us from London.
Hey, thank you for inviting us on.
It's great to have you both, and thank you so much to you both for contributing to the Resilience Report. It was fascinating to read both of your contributions. To start us off, could I ask you to please just give us a quick introduction of yourselves and the work that you do in the context of crisis and resilience, just to orient our audience. Liz, could I start with you?
Okay, thank you very much. Our specialism is large, complex and secure whole of enterprise platforms, digital platforms. And our areas of specialism are heavily regulated or compliance driven industries, for example, energy. Lines of business, high impact lines of business, for example, exploration and production, natural gas, etc., and also emergency preparedness and response. So some of our clients are the National Policing Hub for the Police Chiefs Council, the Home Office Fire and Rescue Services for the UK, and the National Health Service Patient Safety, which has obviously been supporting frontline services and reporting on frontline services during the pandemic, as much as all the other services that need to be run through the National Health Service. So those are examples of what we do.
Thanks very much, Liz. And Sam?
Hi, thanks, Catherine. We're at CT Group, we're a research and campaigns organisation. So the types of crisis that we tend to work with clients on, they tend to be kind of corporate clients, could be an organisational kind of crisis, as we've certainly seen over the last 18 months during COVID, or more regularly in kind of slightly more normal times, regulatory or reputational crisis. And certainly kind of through this chat, I suspect I'll be kind of bringing that element to some of the crises that corporations may have and the lessons that we can learn from the last 18 months. And also some of the very good insights that Stuart gave earlier on as well.
Great. Fantastic. Well, let's get into it. So in the report, you both walk us through key elements in responding to and learning from a crisis. And one of the first steps, of course, is in identifying that a crisis exists and what its implications might be. And Sam, you write quite extensively in the report about the importance of gauging the nature and scale of a crisis at the very outset. However, as we know, and as we've seen over the last year, a crisis can often change shape and trigger other crises. So what advice do you give those clients that you're dealing with about preparing for and approaching a crisis, particularly where the total impacts may not be immediately apparent?
Yeah, I mean, look, picking up on what Stuart said earlier, that leaders during crisis have to make decisions in imperfect situations, quite often without the data or the information they require or would normally kind of like in which to make those decisions. Certainly when we're working in crisis situations, there are basically kind of 3 or 4 key questions that we start with, which is really identifying what that crisis is. Is it an operational one? Is it a reputational one? Is it potentially a kind of regulatory one? And then really defining what success looks like. Quite often we get into situations where success is managing the crisis, which isn't really kind of tangible enough when you're trying to be decisive and make very kind of clear decisions. So really nailing down in terms of what success would look like coming out of that crisis, then understanding who decides that outcome and therefore who you need to be communicating to, what they really kind of care about. And then that'll help inform decisions as to what information you need. It's going to give you the insights in terms of what to communicate and how to act. Quite often, as we've seen in other crises, and this is more on the reputational side or the regulatory one, the initial trigger for the crisis isn't necessarily the one that causes most problems. Sometimes it's, and quite often we've seen in past occasions, it acts as a prompt for other maybe long-standing issues to be raised, which add to the crisis situation, and it starts to expand and become more difficult to manage. In terms of what can be done ahead of that, but from an organization point of view, especially say if it's a reputational one, really understanding how the organization is viewed, where its strengths are viewed and where its weaknesses are viewed among those key audiences, allows leaders to have a data set already and information already on which to make decisions. So when you do get into a crisis situation, you've already kind of got that insurance policy of understanding how you're actually perceived. And so you're not acting, as we would say, on a perception of a perception. We think we're perceived like this. We think this is what audiences think this our strengths are, but actually truly understanding that. And I think as we come out of COVID, what we're certainly seeing among our clients is a greater desire to truly understand how they're viewed, where their strengths are, and then how that relates to a crisis. Is this actually a true crisis which is going to deeply affect us because it taps into a residual or a long-standing view of a weakness, or is it something we can contain more easily because actually we're seen in areas of strength on this and therefore can manage it quite well? And I think undertaking research ahead of, or regularly undertaking research to how you're perceived, allows you to manage certainly reputation and regulatory crises more easily.
Thanks, Sam. I think that really resonates, particularly in the context of COVID, where one of the key words, and there have been a lot of keywords thrown around with COVID, but has been acceleration of trends. And I think really what that's tapping into is latent issues or issues that hadn't bubbled up over the surface that were prompted by COVID to bubble up over the surface. So I think certainly doing that work to understand where those latent issues are that can be triggered by crisis, as secondary crises, is certainly vital work. Liz, a couple of key themes in the report that came through were preparedness and also agility, and the importance of those, particularly underpinned by digital platforms, which, as we've seen, have become crucial tools in the last year. In the report, you distinguish between being digitally enabled and digitally transformed. What's the difference? And should organizations be using digital technology to build resilience? How should they be doing that?
Okay, wow, that's a big question. So I'll try and break that. I'll try and break that down into some constituent components. Going back to both what Stuart and Sam have talked about is, in order to be prepared, preparedness, resilience, and your ability to respond as effectively as possible under the circumstances is based on a number of key ingredients. The first one is having processes, having thought through and having scenarios that you are prepared for, that you have thought through, and having processes that can respond to those scenarios, having exercises, joined exercises that allow your people to rehearse and to practice those and build competence and confidence in those situations, and having the data, having not just the processes, but having information available for it. So those are key constituent components. Now, when you're talking about digital enablement or digital assistance and digital transformation, it's taking those key ingredients and being able to automate them, to computerize them. So we're talking about having computerized processes, having computerized or digital data that is easily available and accessible and can be used very, very quickly for agile decision making. And it's having the ability to make those things interoperable. So when something is digitally assisted or digitally enabled, you may have certain elements, certain activities or processes that are automated or digital, but they don't necessarily join up. And so you end up having to dip in and out of data that might be digital, but data that might be map, physical map that's used because the information available is only in that format. And so you need to assess, the level or the degree of maturity of how many of your processes and procedures are basically automated, how many of them join up, so they're integrated, and how many of those interoperate. Stuart made a very important point. National level or global, some of our clients are global, for example, the energy majors. These people are all federated. They all have operating companies in different countries or in different regions, and each of them have different situations, different terrains, different scenarios. In the UK, for example, for the Home Office, we don't deal with bushfires so much, but we have chemical and industrial fires. Regrettably, we've had acts of terrorism. And so when you're talking about emergency preparedness and response, your scenarios have to integrate as well, because you may be sharing resources across county or regional boundaries. So those are examples of the difference between having a fully integrated platform that allows people to collaborate from different jurisdictions, share resources, share know-how and expertise, and to prepare better by having joint exercise planning and knowledge sharing, as opposed to maybe just having patchy parts of the operation or activities that are online, if you want to put it that way.
And I suppose that integration really lends itself to speed. And as we know, speed can be of the essence in crisis response.
It actually does, it provides several key benefits. The first one is absolutely you are ready to go. You are ready to go on point, because if you are connected, you have the ability to talk to each other more quickly, to share information more quickly. But the interesting thing is it improves confidence as well. When you give people working under pressure the right tools, it makes them feel more confident. And confidence is a big part of your ability to act. Okay. The third part of it is it allows you to learn. And that means that you can do a retrospective, we call them retrospective lessons learned, and you can say, right, well, what information did we have at the time? Which part of that information was really valuable, contemporary, up to date, useful, and what information wasn't as up to date, and we need to basically invest in bringing it up to date. The same thing can be done with your procedures and your action plan. In that scenario, our action plan was really, really good. In this other scenario, it needs to be refreshed, and we need to look at the virtuous cycle of continual learning and improvement. The final point, which was really interesting and we discussed as part of the preparing for this little rehearsal, is actually the accountability part. So when you are perhaps looking at some form of inquiry post a very, very major event, whether it's terrorism or it's bushfires or floods or whatever, it helps you evidence that you made the best possible decisions under those circumstances. This is the data that we had. These are the processes we had. And so you can use your judgment and your years of experience, but there's also an evidence base that said, under those incredibly punishing circumstances, we did the best we could, and you can show that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very important, and picking up on some of the points Stuart made earlier. Now, I want to come on to data. You've both spoken about the importance of using data, assessing data, gathering data, and indeed this was a theme that was touched upon by all of the contributors to the report. Sam, you write about how information can balloon very quickly in a crisis, and I suppose that's both formal and informal information. And it's clearly very important to cut out noise, extraneous noise, in order to extract, communicate, and act on the right insights. So what processes can organizations put in place, both technical, but also, I suppose, communicative, to help them filter out the noise and use the right data, communicate the right data?
Yeah, thank you. And I think this kind of feeds on a little bit from what Liz was saying in terms of the kind of process and scenario planning. we certainly live in an age where there is an abundance of data and an abundance of information. Information doesn't necessarily help you. Insight from the information does, and therefore actually understanding, being able to manipulate that data, being able to see what insights are the key ones to kind of pull out. And it goes back to those original questions in terms of what does success look like, who's going to decide it, and therefore what's the most important information to have. Certainly in terms of an organization, I think there's quite a lot to be learned from kind of military and emergency services for organizations in regards to this. From a process point of view, we certainly find it most effective to have a small team that is dedicated to managing the crisis. It allows the rest of the organization to continue operations and not allow contagion and distraction in other parts of the business. It also allows a very kind of clear chain of command in terms of decision making, and it allows a small group to understand, fully focused on the crisis, what information is most important. And as Liz said, if you have the right process in place and you're assessing the right information, you're gonna be able to weed out the stuff that's just noise. And that allows then leaders to make decisions based on just the kind of critical data and not the extraneous noise that comes in. But I think it also feeds onto the communication as well. Certainly, as we've seen during COVID, there is a ton of information that is out there, different stats, different data from all over the place, which causes confusion and undermines confidence with how leaders are dealing with a crisis situation. What we've seen, we've been researching throughout COVID, some of the most interesting elements from looking at the public and how the public have responded to COVID is we saw a significant uptick in people getting their news from TV as opposed to more the print media. Now that isn't a comment with regards to broadcast journalism versus print journalism. The main reason for that was that people wanted to hear direct from their leaders. They wanted to hear direct from their prime ministers and their political leaders as to what was the information and therefore how should they act. That hearing the information from source was a critical point in giving people the kind of confidence of how they need to react, how they need to respond. But hearing, and as Stuart said earlier, making sure that you're not kind of overloading people with information and key audiences with information, but just the critical information builds that confidence and allows leaders then to kind of be decisive and act on that, with making sure that key audiences, whether they be customers, whether they be the public, whether they be staff, know what to do and have the right information at hand. But it is about kind of weeding down which is the most important information and which is just extraneous noise.
Thanks, Sam. Liz, do you want to share a perspective on that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, again, technology can assist with some of that, particularly under very pressured situations where decision making and timely decision making is of the essence. You can have tools, again, going back to having platforms that enable better decision making. You can have tools, for example, IoT devices that give you very contemporary live feeds of data about an evolving situation. You can use artificial intelligence that can do a lot of crunching for you to establish relevance of data and also serve up, assist decision making by serving up some options, your best options based on certain criteria. So those are the sorts of things that and of course there's an integration of a lot of very valuable data. We work in space observation and earth sciences, and so you can get a mix of satellite data if you're talking about the extent and how something is extending, a situation is extending, and predictive. You can predict based on a number of data feeds and data sources. And all of this can be conflated and made relevant for you, at least as a first pass, and being served up. And it can be used in so many different scenarios, whether it's clinicians, doctors that are needing to make, decisions on the fly about treatments, whether it's field crews that are having to decide where to mobilize very limited resources. Do I send my equipment here and anticipate where it's going to be needed, or do I go straight to where the event is happening now? So those are the sorts of things that again, good digital tools can facilitate the better use of data.
Thanks, Liz. We're going to bring Stuart back in a second, but before we do, I've got one last question that I want to ask you guys, which is about leadership. You're both leaders. You've led your teams over the last year through the crisis that we've all experienced. You're also working with leaders to advise them on how to guide their teams through various crises and emergencies. What do you think are the qualities that make a great leader in crisis? Liz, can I start with you?
I have the privilege of having some incredibly successful clients that work under pressure, both in corporate organizations and also that come from military and from emergency services backgrounds. And I think there are 101s which every leader needs to have: really good communicator, good empathizer, an ability to work with and through other people, to have foresight and planning. I think two key characteristics of leaders that work particularly effectively under crisis are leaders that have the ability to deal with mental complexity, a lot of different moving parts, and they can cope with that and have a good mind's eye for it. And the second part is the ambiguity. They are able to operate effectively and confidently in an ambiguous and uncertain and evolving situation. A lot of corporate leaders are actually trained to run stable state operations, so to navigate a ship and to keep it stable. A leader that has to work in an emergency situation needs to be taught through exercises and reinforcement of their training to just be okay with the fact that they can't control everything and that they are trying to anticipate and respond in the best way they can.
Thanks, Liz. And Sam, interested to hear your thoughts on this. And if I may ask a slightly cheeky question, I'm also interested to hear whether you think there are differences in the skill sets and qualities needed between political leaders and commercial leaders, as I know you work with both.
Thank you for that. I'll pick up on a couple of Liz's points and completely agree with the ability to deal with complexity and ambiguity. Again, from the research that we've done through COVID, there are two very distinct qualities that people look for in leaders. And this is both political and business leaders. So either as an employer, for example, in their organization, or as a political leader. And that is competence and decisiveness. Confidence alone isn't actually a quality people look for. Confidence comes from having the competence of doing it. Now, the way that those kind of then tie in is that you are in a crisis going to have imperfect data, not as much information as you'd normally like to make quite possibly far-reaching decisions. So that's where dealing with the kind of complexity and ambiguity is important. But if you have the competence to be able to do that and you can demonstrate that competence and be decisive and have a good rationale and communicate a clear rationale and a plan for how you're going to deal with the crisis, that's what then kind of breeds the confidence. But there is an overarching thing as well, which is authenticity. And this is important both for political leaders and business leaders. And I might slightly disagree with Liz with regards to the empathy point. If you are not a natural empathetic leader, that doesn't mean you can't be a good leader. You do have to understand how your key audiences, whether it's staff, whether it's customers, whether it's clients, how they're feeling and how they're coping through the crisis, which is picking up on some points that Stuart raised earlier, and a kind of very pertinent question. If you've got a long campaign season in terms of dealing with emergencies, how do you do that kind of man management? Because in the end, it's the people who are going to fight those fires and deal with those emergencies. But if you're not naturally empathetic, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't be a good leader. But you do need to be aware of that and understand how people are feeling so that your communication taps in not only in the message, but also in the tone that you're delivering as well. But that authenticity is really important because key audiences will spot very quickly if you're not being authentic. And the best leaders tend to know themselves well, know where their strengths are, and have people around them that complement potentially where their kind of weaknesses are, and allow that kind of competence and decisiveness to come through.
Fantastic. What an amazing set of insights. There's so much to unpack in every answer you've given. Unfortunately, we don't have the time, but I'm going to invite Stuart back onto screen and we're going to have a Q&A with the audience. Welcome back, Stuart.
Catherine, my pleasure.
So I'm going to go straight to the questions. We've got a great first question here from John, which perhaps is a good question for you in the first instance, Stuart, and then I'll come to you, Liz, which is funding is generally found to respond to crises. Do you think the balance between preparedness funding versus response funding is right? Stuart, your thoughts?
No, I don't think it is. And I think it's a real trap. And probably Sam can provide some insights on the politics of why that happens. But our Commonwealth Productivity Commission, it's our commission that looks at where we should be spending money from a Commonwealth perspective, identified that $1 spent in preparedness saves $7 in response and recovery. So, I mean, it just makes absolute economic sense that we spend more on building resilience before these events happen, rather than providing funds after they occur. But it's a really difficult political argument. Treasuries hate the idea of spending money when they don't see a need for doing it. And just generally, amongst all the cut and thrust of politics, it's a really tough issue. And even within fire and emergency services, there's probably, it wouldn't be more than, it depends how you equate it, but we put a huge amount of effort into the response and a huge amount of resources into response resources, and a lot less into mitigation resources. We probably got the balance right in an urban environment, with fire safety systems and so on, but in lots of other situations, we've still got a lot of improvement to make. So it's a really good point.
Everyone on this call needs to write to their MP. Liz, interested to hear your thoughts on this, particularly as someone who works across agencies. As we know, there are lots of risks across lots of different areas. So I think there's a question not only about preparedness funding, but the distribution of preparedness funding across different areas.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you actually fund whole of operation platforms where you've got multiple stakeholders, and I think it's helpful if you have a national or a federal, in Australia, imperative. The areas where we find that funding is more available for emergency preparedness and response, for example, we work in the nuclear sector as well, is where it's a heavily regulated industry. And in order to operate, in order to have a license to operate, you have to demonstrate that you have plans in place to identify, assess quickly, and mitigate and respond to those risks. So perversely, it's easier to get funding for emergency preparedness and response, or incident preparedness and response, in the event that it's a heavily regulated industry. The second element of it is more practical, is when we're working with clients in those areas, it's all about how you approach service design. So you may not have a separate funding for emergency preparedness or resilience, but what you can do is you can have that as one of the key criteria when you're actually designing the service and designing your scenarios of how you're going to use your data. So you sort of build it in, rather than try to justify it as a separate sort of design process. And so we do it a little bit through stealth and through future-proofing whatever we're building at the time. And that's a more practical solution.
Thanks, Liz. Sam, did you want to share a perspective?
I think there's a couple of points that I'd make, because I think some of the points that Stuart made with regards to the funding also apply equally in organisations as well. I said right at the start that in any crisis, when a crisis kicks off, time is of the essence, especially if it's kind of reputational or regulatory one. From an organisation point of view, I'll kind of slightly step away from the kind of emergency services where I do not have any area of expertise, and we're kind of bow to Stuart and Liz in terms of that. But from a say a reputational or regulatory one, when the crisis kicks off, there isn't sufficient data. But if research is done ahead as to how you're kind of perceived, and therefore you know what your equities are and your disequities are, you already have a bank of information of which you can start making very solid decisions, and allows leaders the confidence that they are making those initial right decisions. But I would say the same in organizations, that sometimes there is reluctance when there isn't a crisis to to put those resources into understanding that during kind of quieter times and normal times, but then they tend to do it during crises and where it's sometimes too late. But I think as we go through COVID, and certainly conversations we're having with clients, potential clients, there is a great recognition of that as we've gone through this, of right, what can we do to ensure resilience of potential crisis coming up in the future. Just touching on how that might manifest itself at more kind of national level. And the resilience question with regards specifically to a nation's economy. We saw very early on that across governments across the world, actually, what we would call economic sovereignty. The disruption to supply chains, the disruption to national economies has been obviously significant during the COVID crisis. And what we're starting to see is very much questioning of what do we produce on our own shores? Are our supply chains too narrow or too dependent on a couple of overseas territories? Do we need to expand those? Do we need to produce more online? Do we as an economy need to become more resilient? Because while this has been a global crisis, you can understand from a population's point of view, and then from a voter's point of view, if you want to look at it from a political point of view, it is very much of how are we coping as a nation? How are we doing? One of the really surprising things through COVID is actually how quickly bad policy has spread. So when a neighboring country or another country starts introducing something, within a couple of days, there's almost immediate questions of why aren't we doing this? Well, hang on a minute, we don't know whether it's working yet, but that kind of flies around. So I think that economic sovereignty, which is a critical kind of part of resilience, which is not anti-globalization at all or nationalistic, it's just making sure that your economy is resilient in the face of future global crises, is a key question that is being asked at the moment and being looked at.
We've got a great question here from the audience around the implications of all of this for smaller organizations. So whether it be building self-sufficiency, diversification, putting in place systems of resilience, those all take time and resource. And this person asks, what advice would you give to smaller organizations who would like to implement resilience planning and investment, but don't feel that it's a high priority or reality right now? Now, I know most of you do deal with larger organizations, but I'm interested to hear if you were going to prioritize something or some elements for a small organization to invest in that were realistic and at scale, what would they be? Who would like to tackle that first?
Catherine, I'm happy to step off. Look up to the 2 points I would make for smaller organizations. Elizabeth talked about retrospectives and learning, which is absolutely vital, because otherwise we're going to repeat mistakes. But there's another approach called pre-mortem, but people could Google and look up, which is just sitting around a table and looking at, if things went really wrong, what are the implications?
Wargaming.
Yeah, it is wargaming. But again, there's an approach and a methodology to it. And I think, whatever the size of your organization, you can do that. The other point I'd make is we can all adopt a helicopter view. And I know we throw that term around, but I think for emergency management, it's really apt. It's not the strategy view from space. It's not the on-ground view. It's the helicopter view, which is far enough up to see beyond the horizon, but not far enough up to lose contact with what's going on. And so again, I think for every organization, regardless of their size, there's a relevant height for them to adopt that helicopter view.
Thanks, Stuart.
I can offer a view if you like.
Please.
Okay, so I think there are two scenarios here. The first one is where you're talking, and I'll speak broadly about the Home Office Fire and Rescue Services Hub. We assess as part of a technical due diligence, we assess the organization's ability to maintain and use technology and data. How sophisticated are they? How much in-house expertise do they have? And then we right size their solution for that particular organization. So for example, in the fire services in the UK, you have everything from a very, very small fire station, of which I think there are more than 11,000. We join up about 11,000 individual fire local fire stations, as well as the regional hubs. And each of those has got different technology and data requirements, or footprint, if you want to think of it that way. And then what you do is, when you develop these whole of enterprise platforms, is you make them federated. You give people the appropriate autonomy on the ground to right size their investment in data and tech so that it's a sustainable solution for them, but you ensure that it connects to and can interoperate with a national hub. Okay, that requires expertise at the architecture level. So it needs to be thoughtfully planned. So that's one scenario. The second scenario is when you're talking about smaller organizations that are operating autonomously. So for example, small and medium-sized businesses that are scaling up. And in that situation, again, there are lots of options out there that can be available on the cloud. They can provide you the tech, they can provide you repositories for your data, they can provide you with the security layers as well, and you can customize and configure them. And you're not operating your own dedicated estate. You are actually consuming infrastructure that is available on a click agreement in some cases if you really want entry level, or on a service level agreement if you want to get a little bit more sophisticated and scale up. So those are the two answers to two slightly different scenarios, which will allow you to right size your investment and your decisions about tech and data.
Thanks, Liz.
And Catherine, I'll just add another thing on that, which is a completely no cost point as well. Normally in any crisis situation, you have a very small team that looks after the crisis, and they're the ones that learn a lot during that crisis because they're managing the crisis while the rest of the organization gets on with the kind of normal run of business. COVID has been on such a scale that the reverse has kind of been true, and the best organizations, most people in the organization have actually been dealing with the crisis of keeping the business going, keeping the organization going during COVID, while the best organizations then have a very small team that looks post-COVID, where do we need to be? What information do we need? Where's the market going? How are we going to come out of COVID stronger? But because you've had most people in the organization, this applies to any size organization, it may well be one of the first times that almost all of the staff have actually been very much hands-on in terms of managing the crisis. And therefore a formal process of making sure that you feed in everyone's experiences from that, managing that crisis, will very much help you be more resilient in the future, because each individual will have learned lessons during it, both from their own professional development point of view, but also from an organizational point of view as well.
Thanks so much, Sam. We're getting perilously close to time here. So I'm going to ask one final wrap-up question, and I do ask everyone to give me as crisp an answer as possible. I'm going to ask each of you to take a little bit of a look into your crystal ball and talk a little bit about where you think the next crisis, far-reaching crisis like COVID, is coming from. It is a crystal ball question, but what is keeping you up at night? And at the risk of being a little bit reductive, I'd like to ask you to distill down one key takeaway for those on the call today about what is one thing that they or their organization can do today to build resilience for the crisis of tomorrow. Sam, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, I'll do the second one first. I think actually reverts to the original point that so many people during this period have gone through a crisis situation, perhaps for the first time, and they will have learned a lot from it. They will have been, maybe certainly in the kind of UK, feeling slightly jaded because we've been in lockdown for quite a long time, but they will have learned an enormous amount from it, both in terms of their personal resilience, but also in terms of the organization as well. And making sure that time is spent reflecting on the lessons learned from that, I think is vitally important. I think on the crystal ball side of things, I suspect over in the kind of immediate future, the main focus is in terms of driving economic activity for any organization, and where the market has moved to, what new normal kind of looks like, and making sure that early decisions are made in terms of getting a sure footing for organizations, many of which have had a very hard time during kind of COVID, to get back on their feet and drive that.
Thank you, Sam. Stuart.
Look, I think I would have to say climate. I think for us it is probably the area of very significant concern, because we're not scientists, but we're seeing the changed environment that we're operating in. And so I think there's going to be other climate crises from our perspective. I think if I was offering advice, it would be understand what makes your resilient system, whatever that might be. You know, it's certainly, you know, what Liz was talking about with data and all your stakeholders and all your risks and what mitigations you can put in place. But whatever your size, you can map out what would make you resilient by understanding your resilient system.
Thank you, Stuart. And Liz, to you, I give the last word.
I hate being last, especially also. I mean, Sam and Stuart have answered the question fabulously. I think I've got a two-part answer to that. The first part, which is the two parts to your question. The first one is, as an organization, we have gone through breathtaking impact based on all of the crisis events that we've confronted, both environmental, the impact on our society, including the mental health and well-being of our people, the impact on our business. I would suggest that we just take a breath and look at a consolidation period and say, okay, we've had to react and respond under emergency operating circumstances. Let's just now build ourselves a little bit of breathing space, assess how far we've come and consolidate that so that we really have the resilience rather than just the reaction on an organizational level, a corporation or service level. And in terms of your question about looking forward, and you will know this already, Catherine, I think the sustainable land asset management and how you sustainably continue to work, to live, to operate is really important. So I would look at sustainable operations that deliver the minimum impact on the environment, the minimum adverse impact on your people, whether that's working patterns, whether that's resource usage, whether it's your carbon footprint. So sustainable operations and sustainable use of our resources, because we are now starting to genuinely have to confront the fact that we have maybe not been as judicious with our use of very valuable resources, because it affects our people, it affects society and humanity, the way that we behave. Those are the two things.
Very well said, Liz. Thank you so much. With great regret, I now have to bring this session to a close. We're a little bit over, so I thank our speakers for staying with us a little bit past the hour. Wow, this has been one of my favorite sessions of the year so far. Each of you could very comfortably give a masterclass on this topic on your own, and we've been so privileged to have all three of you condense 3 masterclasses into one webinar. It's been incredibly inspiring. I do come back to Stuart's initial point around resilience as a system, and I do encourage everybody on this call to be inspired by what we've heard from our speakers today and to take agency of your own resilience, organizationally, personally. Unfortunately, we do live in a world that is riven with challenges and crises, but I think what today has really demonstrated for me is that you can put in place the skills, the pre-planning, the investment, the partnerships, the processes to empower yourself in those situations. So thank you so much to each of you for joining us, and it's been a real privilege.
Thanks, Catherine.
My pleasure.
Likewise.
Thank you again to Informed Solutions, Liz, for your partnership on this report. It's been great to collaborate with you. To all of our guests, if you enjoyed this event, then I also recommend you attend our upcoming webinar next Thursday, which will extend upon several of the themes we've spoken about today. That's our session with the very resilient former Australian Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, who will be talking about some of the big challenges facing leaders in the decade ahead. I'm sure we'll pick up on a number of the themes we've spoken about today and how we might tackle them. You can go to our website to check out the details. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and well done to everyone for all the resilience we've displayed over the last year. We all do hope that there are some brighter times in the near future. We start to release lockdown from next week. I'm looking forward to a haircut. I'm sure other people are as well. I do wish everyone a very safe and healthy rest of week, and looking forward to seeing you in person again soon.
And thank you, Catherine, also for a fantastically well run event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Catherine.
much. Bye, everyone.